Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now anyone who finds themselves messing around with a Pentium 4 in 2020 will realise that not only will the chip struggle to run modern games, but it will also have a hard time handling Windows 10. You don't have to be doing anything for a single core hyper-threaded CPU like this to hit 100% usage, and the Pentium D, which is essentially two Pentium 4s stuck together, will fare no better. But then I remembered the time that we ran some modern titles on a Core 2 Duo utilising 4K resolution to try and eliminate lag. To some degree it worked, although in other games, well, there really wasn't much of a difference and sometimes it made things worse. But I did notice a couple of occasions in that video whereby the 1.1% lows were a little better off when running at 4K because more strain was put on the GPU. So could this work here? Using a GTX 1080 Ti, could we actually get playable frame rates with a Pentium D processor? Well, I guess we should find out. This is the ultimate bottlenecking experience. Now you may think that turning everything down within the game's graphical menus would be the best bet, including the resolution, and this is tempting if you have an aging processor that's struggling to keep up. Actually, I'm not going to try and justify my reasoning behind this little adventure. I was just curious and thought the results would be interesting because, like most of the time, I had no clue what to expect when going into this. Let me just give you an example of the whole 4K thing. Here's Skyrim Special Edition running on the Pentium D and GTX 1080 Ti at 1080p. We're averaging a whopping 8 frames per second in this area. If we switch to 2160p and give the graphics card more work to do, then our frame rate increases to 12. Not a huge difference because the CPU is maxing out quite a lot of the time anyway, but this difference could mean crossing the line between playable and unplayable in some instances, so all of today's tests were carried out at 3840 by 2160. Can this high-end card redeem the decade-and-a-half-old Pentium? Well, I'm not sure what you were expecting, and I wasn't sure what I was expecting, to be honest, but let's start off with Call of Duty Black Ops. It's an older game in the series, and we were almost able to get it running at 30 frames per second. So just like with Skyrim, there really wasn't too much difference between 1080p and 4K. 4K did produce a few more frames, so I thought that was the best bet in terms of gameplay throughout today. This isn't what I would call playable, but let's see if CSGO fares any better. As you can see, it does not. Now, it seemed like the Pentium D struggled more and more as we went on today, as if it was just giving up, taking its last breaths right before me. But yeah, CSGO here ran with about 15 frames per second, so again it wasn't playable even at 1080p because I tested 1080p as well. I just showed you the 4K footage, didn't run very well at all. The same can be said for Crysis, though it fared a little bit better. We were seeing about 20 frames per second here on average, which really wasn't too bad. This is how I used to play back on my Pentium 4 and 6600 GT, my grandparents' PC back in the day. So yeah, the experience for me doesn't feel too bad, but by modern standards and what I'm used to now, well, it's not exactly brilliant, to put it lightly. The CPU though isn't quite maxing out, as you can see here, but that's just Crysis for you. Fallout New Vegas was probably the most playable game of the day. Once again, the CPU wasn't quite maxing out here at 4K, although it was at 1080p. Our GPU is barely being utilised, to be honest, but we were able to just about scrape 30 FPS with Fallout New Vegas, possibly my possibly my favourite Fallout in the series. So that's nice to see. If I was stuck with a Pentium D and for some reason had a 1080 Ti, well, then I'd be fairly happy. Once again, let's return to Skyrim Special Edition here. We're actually in the town of Riverwood now, where the frame rate slightly improved. We were seeing 16 frames per second on average at 4K with the Pentium D 3.4 GHz and Nvidia's top-end 1080 Ti. If you were to pair a 2080 Ti with the Pentium D, well, of course you'd see no difference. This truly is an extreme bottleneck situation here. Finally, the Outer Worlds was running at very high settings, once again with 4K resolution, something that the 1080 Ti is capable of under normal circumstances, with anywhere between 30 and 60 FPS. It actually didn't do too badly here, not as bad as I thought. It took a while to actually start, or the Epic Game Store did anyway, but once we had started the game, we were seeing around 20 frames per second, so it could have been a lot worse. But let's talk about the problems of the day. Shadow of the Tomb Raider actually broke this PC. It started up, the screen went blank, and then the PC just shut down and wouldn't boot up again. I honestly thought the processor had just failed, but I reset the CMOS battery, reseated the graphics card and reseated the processor, and this is the only way I could get the PC to boot. So I had a little bit of a mild scare with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Shadow of the Tomb Raider? Rise of the Tomb Raider? It was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, yeah. It just did not like this PC whatsoever. GTA 5 was another problematic experience because we couldn't actually get past the loading screen, whether it be for story mode or online mode. I must have sat at this screen for about 40 minutes and nothing happened. Maybe I was just a bit too impatient. Here's an example of the Epic Game Store, something I mentioned earlier. This took quite a while to actually start up. And of course, once I was in the Epic Game Store, I was able to try the Outer Worlds, which started fine, but Fortnite just stuck here every time and then eventually closed. So this has been the ultimate bottleneck experience. What does this video teach us about PC hardware, I hear you ask? Well, honestly, not much. I guess if you have a Pentium D or any dual-core CPU from around 2006 in your PC, then don't stick a GTX 1080 Ti in there. Actually, I'd probably recommend something like a GT 1030 at the very most, because even something like that will allow such a chip to reach its maximum potential. I also tried this with a Pentium 4 briefly today because I've got a Pentium 4 versus Pentium D video in the works, and I needed to make sure they both worked as they should. You might be thinking at this point, well, why make a comparison like that these days? With modern software and operating systems, so much has changed and the performance of the two is now closer than ever, and I wanted to take a good, proper look at whether or not these are realistically usable outside of things like gaming. Now, when I say that the performance is closer than ever, I don't mean in a good way, I mean they're just equally as bad. I also recently purchased about 15 used processors at a cost of 25p each, and I'll throw them all up in a comparison table to see which ones do the best. It's a while off yet as there is so much to test, but it's quite a hilariously disastrous experience to say the least, so hopefully you can join me for that video. Back to summarising this one though, and I'm surprised that the Outer Worlds ran, to be honest. It could have just crashed like a couple of the others, but it hung in there. The reason I mention that game is because not only did it run, but it probably ran far better than I thought it would when initially going into it. So there are a few surprises when using the Pentium D in modern times. I guess all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching this chaotic episode of things that you probably shouldn't do. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.